In the halls of Georgia Tech, there is a name that has become legendary, a name that has become synonymous with the school itself. But this isn't the name of a famous professor or a notable alumni. This is the name of a fictional student, a student that has somehow managed to leave a mark on the school that will never be forgotten. This is the story of George P. Burdell. It all started in 1927 when William Edgar Ed Smith mistakenly received two enrollment forms from Georgia Tech. As a joke, he filled out the second form under the name George P. Burdell, but what started as a prank soon became something much more. Smith and his friends completed all the required assignments for Burdell, and soon he was receiving a bachelor's degree in 1930, and later a master's. But this was just the beginning of Burdell's story. During World War II, Burdell served on a B-17 bomber, flying 12 missions before being caught. He even attended Harvard from 1940 to 1941. In 1958, Burdell was even married to another fake student, Agnes Scott of Agnes Scott College. And even though Georgia Tech moved to digital class registration in 1969, Burdell was registered for over 3,000 credit hours. And even though there was no swimming and diving team in 1988, after the demolition of the Heisman Gym, Burdell's name is still listed as the captain of the team on their record board. He was even the leading candidate for Times Person of the Year in 2001, with over 57% of the public votes in his favor before being removed by the administration. Today, Burdell's legacy lives on. He is listed as the 2020 Alumni Association 30 Under 30 list. But who was George P. Burdell, and why has he become such a beloved figure at Georgia Tech? This is the story of the legend that is George P. Burdell.
So have you heard of George P. Burdell?
Yes.
What have you heard about him?
He's like a guy who he didn't go to Georgia Tech. I'm not sure if he applied or not, but he filled out an application. Some dude filled out an application for George P. Burdell. I don't know if he got admitted or not. I think he did, and then he just kind of like kept doing it or something.
So how did you hear about him?
When I toured this place before college.
So they gave you it during like a freshman seminar?
No. When I like toured this place and like learned about the college when I was in high school before I was admitted into the school, they discussed it, and I believe it was discussed during Facet, but it was discussed in more detail. And I've heard the name floated around, and I've like looked at the Wikipedia article a couple times, but.
Do you know any places his name is used nowadays?
That Burdell store in the student center. Besides that, I don't know.
What do you think about George P. Burdell's story in general?
I think it's interesting. It's a little nifty fact about Georgia Tech that other institutes might not have.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
All right. So have you ever heard of George P. Burdell?
I have.
And what have you heard about him?
So I know he has a degree in every single major here at Georgia Tech. I know he started as a prank, and he's named after the guy who submitted the application. It's named after his principal. I know that.
How did you hear about him?
I saw it on Georgia Tech's Instagram, I think right after I submitted my application, and I was like, well, who's George P. Burdell? So I Googled it, and that's how I heard about it.
Do you know that he's never actually existed?
Yeah.
And what do you think about the George P. Burdell story in general?
I think it's a really fun tradition, you know, the George P. Burdell lore. I like it a lot.
All right, thank you.
School project, I was asking if I could interview you for a minute.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so have you ever heard of George P. Burdell?
Yeah, he studied at Tech, right?
Yeah, he studied at Tech. What have you heard about him?
That he majored in like everything.
Yeah.
I don't think that's possible though.
Yeah, so how did you hear about him? Like, was it as a freshman through upperclassmen? Was it at a Georgia Tech event, etc.?
I mean, I wasn't eavesdropping, but some of my friends talked about him.
Yeah.
Someday.
Do you know that he's never existed? He was made up by a group of freshman students in 1927, and that tradition has continued ever since.
Oh, damn. I mean, I didn't like 100% believe them, but like, yeah, it's funny.
Yeah.
Funny.
What do you think about the George P. Burdell story in general?
I mean, it's a cool story. It's like, I think it makes students of Georgia Tech like study harder. That there was this guy in 19 I don't know when that he majored in like everything.
Yeah,
That's
it's very interesting. Thank you for your time today.
Yep,
Have you ever heard of G.P. Burdell?
I have. Yeah,
What have you heard about him?
that he was like kind of a urban legend in the Georgia Tech community.
And how did you hear about him?
I think at Bassett, the counselors and stuff were kind of talking about him. They did a segment on like school traditions.
So was an upperclassman
Yeah,
and at a Georgia Tech event.
yeah,
Do you know that he's never existed?
I did know that. Yeah, they talked about it.
Did you know that he was made up by a group of freshman students in 1927, and that the tradition has continued ever since?
I did. It was supposed to be like a little prank, right?
Yes, it indeed was. What do you think about G.P. Burdell's story in general?
I think it's funny that they were like so successful to convince people that he existed for so long.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, have you ever heard of George P. Burdell?
Yes.
Okay, what have you heard about him?
That he's taken every single class. That's what I've heard.
Okay, yeah, fair. How'd you hear about him?
One of my freshman classes, I think.
Okay, was it through an upperclassman?
Yeah.
Or was it just in the class, like, in general?
Like, I feel like they like mentioned it. And I was like, oh, who are they talking about? And like, I asked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. And then did you know that like that's like a big Georgia Tech myth and he's never existed?
Yeah, I didn't think he was. That would be crazy. That's a lot of money.
Yeah. So he was actually made up by a group of freshmen in 1927, and then just ever since the traditions continued, and someone's always like enrolled him in classes, and
That's
it's
funny.
just kept going.
That's really funny.
Okay, and then last question. Overall, just like what do you think about the story?
I feel like it's funny just to like keep saying it, you know?
Okay,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
We cannot ignore his continued presence in the Georgia Tech community. Incoming freshmen are still introduced to him as one of the greatest alumni to graduate from the school. His name is paged by first-year marching band students during football games and even at airports, bars, and hotels. It is not uncommon for Georgia Tech students or alumni to use his name as an alias when they do not want to disclose their real name. Burdell's influence can be seen beyond the Georgia Tech campus. Recently, a newspaper published in its community calendar that Burdell was unavoidably detained on Friday night and was unable to sit in the Relay for Life dunking booth. His slide rule was confiscated by TSA at the Augusta airport. Burdell's legacy lives on in the digital age, as he has a presence on social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook. In fact, in 2011, he even became a writer for the 6 Mile Post at the Cartersville campus of Georgia Highlands College. Despite being a fictitious character, George P. Burdell has left a lasting impression on Georgia Tech and its community. He has become an enduring symbol of the ingenuity, humor, and irreverence of the Yellow Jacket spirit.